But before we get to the DNA results that shattered the Deep South's oldest racial myth, understand this first. One legal trick hid the truth for generations. And this story begins more than 300 years ago. The American Deep South built the most rigid racial system anywhere in the Western Hemisphere and enforced it ruthlessly. From the tidewater plantations of Virginia to the bayous of Louisiana, every person was sorted into two categories: white or black, free or enslaved. There was no middle ground, and no ambiguity was ever allowed. And the instrument that enforced this racial binary was deceptively simple. It was called the one-drop rule. The concept first emerged in the colonial era, but it was formalized into law during the late 1800s and the early 1900s. The principle behind this classification was absolute, and there were no exceptions. If you had any known African ancestry, any single ancestor, no matter how distant, you were legally classified as black. One single drop of African blood. That was the threshold. Not half, not a quarter. One drop. This legal framework did something remarkable to the cultural imagination. It created the illusion of two completely separate populations. Two bloodlines that never crossed. Two genetic worlds that existed side by side but supposedly never touched. Census records reinforced this divide. Church registries reinforced it too. And marriage laws enforced it with criminal penalties. And over time, the people of the Deep South internalized a certainty about their own ancestry that felt unshakable. White families were certain their heritage was purely European, and black families understood their roots were entirely African. Everyone knew exactly which side of the line they stood on. The categories felt ancient, biological, inevitable. And if you had asked any geneticist before the year 2000 what they expected in Deep South DNA, the answer would have been two distinct populations, separated by centuries of enforced endogamy, legal prohibition, and social terror. That was the expectation, what the historical record seemed to guarantee. Then geneticists opened the data, and the categories collapsed. In the early 2010s, something unprecedented began to happen in the field of American genetic science. Consumer DNA companies, most notably 23andMe, began building enormous databases of genetic information tied to racial identity. At the same time, researchers at Harvard, Penn, and several Southern universities began pooling autosomal DNA data. Data drawn from across the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. State by state, sample by sample. Autosomal DNA is the gold standard for ancestry composition. Unlike Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA, which trace only one parental line, it captures the full picture. Every ancestor, every generation, every encounter that left a genetic trace, recorded or not. The first anomaly appeared in European identified samples. Researchers flagged it quietly at first, uncertain of what they were seeing. Individuals who self-identified as white, whose families had identified as white for as far back as anyone could remember, were carrying African genetic markers. Not in isolated cases, not as statistical noise, but in consistent, measurable percentages. The average hidden African ancestry among self-identified white Southerners ranged from 2 to 5%. In certain rural counties, particularly in Louisiana, along the coast of South Carolina and across the Mississippi Delta, the percentages spiked dramatically higher. Some individuals carried 8, 10, even 12% sub-Saharan African ancestry with no family knowledge of it whatsoever. This was not what the textbooks predicted. This was not what the one-drop rule was supposed to allow. If a single drop made you black, how did millions of white Southerners carry African DNA in total silence? But here's where it gets interesting. The African-American genetic data was even more unexpected than anyone predicted. To understand the genetic architecture of the Deep South, you have to go back to the very beginning. And the beginning was not English. It was French and Spanish. They brought an entirely different racial framework. When France established Louisiana in the early 1700s, French and Spanish colonial law recognized intermediate racial categories. Mixed-race individuals were not automatically pushed to the bottom. In many cases, they occupied a distinct middle tier in society. They held legal rights, owned property, and carried social standing that the rigid British racial system never once permitted. This produced something extraordinary. The Plaçage system in New Orleans formalized unions between European men and women of African descent. These were not secret affairs. They were contractual arrangements conducted openly, with financial provisions for the women and children involved. The children of these unions formed the backbone of Louisiana's gens de couleur libre, the free people of color. By 1830, this community numbered in the tens of thousands, a genetic legacy still traceable in DNA today. These unions left a permanent mark in the DNA of an entire people, and they were only the beginning. Across the Deep South during the slavery era, sexual exploitation was endemic. The genetic evidence is now overwhelming. Mitochondrial DNA studies show enslaved women bore children fathered by European men, at rates no historical document fully captures. These encounters, most of them coerced, many of them violent, wrote themselves into the genome of every subsequent generation. But the mixing was not limited to two groups. Native Americans were woven into this genetic fabric from the start. Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole, intermarriage and forced displacement created communities that carried three continental ancestries simultaneously. Triracial isolate communities began to emerge across the South. The Melangons of Appalachia, the Redbones of Western Louisiana, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina, the Lambi of North Carolina. These groups defied every racial category the census offered. After Reconstruction, they were simply reclassified, erased, pushed into one box or another. And what followed was not passive, it was active, deliberate, and thorough. County clerks changed records, families changed their names, entire communities picked up and left. They migrated to regions where no one knew their history and reinvented their racial identity completely from scratch. The paper trail went cold. But the DNA kept every receipt, every crossing, every union, every hidden generation. And in the isolated counties of the Appalachian foothills and the Gulf Coast interior, something else was happening. Endogamy, marriage within small, close communities, amplified rare genetic markers that would otherwise have been diluted over time. What scientists found was this: those genetic signatures had become fingerprints, traceable, unmistakable, and impossible to explain away. Then, researchers found one genetic signature that changed everything. When scientists separated the DNA data by inheritance pathway, the Deep South revealed a pattern so stark it reads like an indictment. Y chromosome analysis traces the paternal line, father to son to grandson, unbroken. In African American men across the Deep South, Y chromosome lines are overwhelmingly European. Studies published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found 30 to 40% of African American men in South Carolina and Louisiana carry paternal haplogroups tracing to Western Europe. In some counties, it exceeds 50%. Now, contrast that with mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material inherited exclusively from the mother. In those same populations, the mitochondrial haplogroups are almost entirely sub-Saharan African, with significant Native American ancestry present across certain southern regions. The asymmetry is devastating. European men father children with African and Native women, reshaping the entire genetic landscape. The Y chromosomes tell the story of the fathers, and the mitochondrial DNA tells the story of the mothers. And those two stories do not match. But the data also cuts both ways across the racial divide. When researchers examine white Southern families rooted in those same counties, they found something no family Bible ever recorded. A measurable percentage carried African mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, the same haplogroups found in the black families down the road. The same maternal lineages, the same ancient mothers, shared bloodlines hidden on both sides of the racial divide. DNA reveals what no census would ever admit. Shared bloodlines spanning the color line, connecting households on opposite sides of the most enforced racial boundary in American history. Brothers and sisters separated not by genetics, but by law. Before we get to the most shocking finding, if you're the kind of person who digs deeper, hit subscribe. We uncover one genetic mystery every week. When scientists compared this to the rest of America, the results were staggering. The Deep South is not genetically typical of America. It is an outlier, and the numbers make this unmistakable. Self-identified white individuals in the Deep South carry, on average, 4 times more African ancestry than their counterparts in the Midwest or Pacific Northwest. Louisiana and South Carolina consistently rank highest for admixture among white-identified populations nationwide. On the other side, African Americans in the Deep South carry 20 to 25% European ancestry on average. In some parishes of Louisiana, the European component exceeds 35%. These are not outliers in the data. These are the central tendencies, the averages. And then there is the ghost ancestry. Native American genetic markers appear in clusters that no migration map predicted. Communities in eastern Mississippi and western Alabama carry native heritage at rates that suggest sustained multi-generational intermixing, not a single distant ancestor, but centuries of ongoing genetic exchange across communities. Much of this heritage was suppressed during the Indian removal era, when claiming native identity became legally and socially dangerous. Here is the finding that stops researchers in their tracks. Genetic distance between races is smallest where segregation was harshest. Counties with the strictest Jim Crow laws and most violent policing of racial boundaries show the highest genetic blending. Segregation did not prevent mixing, it concealed it. But the most shocking finding was still buried in the data. Researchers at Emory University and the Broad Institute mapped rare genetic variants by county. What scientists found was extraordinary. Entire counties in the Deep South share identical rare genetic markers across racial lines. Not common variants, rare ones. Variants in fewer than 1% of the global population. Markers indicating shared ancestry not thousands of years ago, within the last 5 to 8 generations. In county after county, white families and black families are biological relatives, not in some abstract all humans are related sense, in a specific, traceable, genealogical sense. They share great-great-grandparents. They share lineages split apart by law and reclassified into separate races within living memory. The data is clear. Legal segregation did not reflect biological reality. It masked it. The one-drop rule did not separate two populations. It forced one blended population to perform a fiction of division. America's most divided region is genetically its most blended. So, what does this mean for you, personally? What modern DNA tests reveal is not a simple pie chart. They reveal hidden genetic history. The story your family told and what your genome carries are never the same. Every bloodline in the American South, every single one, is more complex than the narrative it was assigned. Heritage, passed down at kitchen tables and church pews, was shaped by laws that decided who counted as what. The genetic evidence shows something different. It shows identity in America was always constructed, always performed, never purely biological. This does not erase history. Racial categories decided who voted, who owned land, and who lived or died. Those consequences were real. But the bright lines between white and black, the Deep South called natural and eternal, were always a legal invention. The data is clear. Those lines were never biological. And the DNA proves it. The ancestry you carry is deeper and more tangled than any label can contain. Your bloodlines crossed uncrossable borders. Your ancestors defied categories that were enforced at gunpoint. And the proof has been inside you this entire time, written in 3 billion base pairs, waiting to be read. And one region's DNA is even more shocking. If you want to know what your DNA really reveals about your ancestry, subscribe. One genetic mystery every week. Appalachian DNA is next. What scientists found in those mountain bloodlines challenges